Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Smedberg, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our November live stream program. These are monthly programs that allow us to talk a little bit more about the programs that Church World Service has going on, both here domestically in the United States and their impact on communities all over the world. If you like what you hear today, be sure to hit that like button, share this video on whatever social platform you're on. We are streaming now on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. So share, let your friends, let your family know about the great work we are doing. This week and this month, we are joined we have a special guest, Nuha Montesser. Did I say that correct?
Yeah, Nuha Montasser.
Montasser, sorry.
No, it's
Uh,
okay.
Nuha is a policy and advocacy coordinator here for Church World Service. And our topic today is going to be on presidential determination on refugee admissions. Now, I'm going to be very quick to admit, before I came to work for Church World Service, I had never even heard of this. So this will be not only a great opportunity for you at home to learn, but also, I'll be learning a lot of this myself too today. And also, for those of you in the chat who are joining us today, if you have a question for Nuha, throw it in there. We will get to your questions at the end of today's program. So, Nuha, thank you so much for joining us today. We're both up here in New England, so I know it's a beautiful New England day up here for us.
It is. I'm really excited to go outside today, sometime after the meeting.
Yeah, we don't usually get to say that here in early November. So,
Right.
to have a day like that, that's great. So, let's just get started. Now, Nuha, can you walk us through kind of the process that a refugee goes through? My understanding is that it's like a maybe 13 to 15 step process and takes the course over several years. Can you walk us through kind of how that all works and comes together?
Absolutely. I think that is a great question to start with. You're right. It is a very long process, many, many steps, and it takes a very long time. So, allow me to break down the general process and then, also include sub processes as well, such as, the security vetting process, right? So, generally, the US has a resettlement support center abroad, or many centers abroad, to process refugee cases and to coordinate administrative aspects of the program. So RSCs serve to pre-screen refugees once they've been referred by the UNHCR to ensure they fall within U.S. designated nationalities and processing priorities. Um, what they do is they create files for each case considered by the U.S. and prepare refugees for their interviews with refugee officers from the Department of Homeland Security and USCIS. So, at which point DHS and USCIS conduct interviews to determine whether or not an applicant is eligible for resettlement in the US. And so, specifically, when families seek protection, all adults will be interviewed, though only one member of the family must meet the US refugee definition in order to be considered, right? So, spouses and unmarried children under the age of 21 derive their status based on that of the primary applicant. So, you may ask, what do they actually look at, right? So, what they do is they look at or perhaps confirm the basic biographic data of the applicants. They verify that applicants were properly given access to the U.S. refugee admissions program. They determine whether the principal applicant has suffered past persecution or perhaps has well-founded fear for future persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or even membership in a particular social group. It also, they determine whether the applicants are admissible to the United States and have not participated in persecution of others themselves, and they determine whether the principal applicant has been firmly resettled in another country, right? So the finding of which would make this person ineligible for resettlement through the United States Refugee Admissions Program. And what they also look at or determine is whether, there is discretion or should be discretion, perhaps favorably to approve the application itself. So, after the screenings from UNHCR and a successful interview with DHS and USCIS, with everything that I just broke down, applicants must go through additional medical and security checks, right? So the US screens for certain medical needs so that certain conditions can be treated before travel. And then not just that, numerous security checks through multiple federal and international databases are required and processed for all refugees. So specifically, the Department of State checks the refugee's name against the U.S. watch list through its consular lookout and support system. Another thing is certain refugees undergo an additional security review called the Security Advisory Opinion. Another thing that they do, or the next step, is that the National Counterterrorism Center conducts an interagency check on the applicant within a designated age range, right? Syrian refugees referred to the U.S. for resettlement are flagged for additional security screening. USCIS conducts, at which point, an in-person interview with a refugee abroad at their location. So what that means specifically is that a highly trained USCIS officer conducts a detailed face-to-face interview with the applicant, as well as accompanying family members over the age of 14. And this is where the officer collects the applicant's fingerprints and photographs. The officer evaluates the applicant's credibility and considers whether, their testimony is consistent with the country's condition, right? And so, in addition to that, if the necessary criteria are met, the USCIS officer conditionally approves the refugee's application for resettlement and submits it to the State Department for final processing. And so, at which point the final processing includes USCIS coordinating 3 biometric checks, which include an FBI screening, a DHS screening, and a DOD screening. And I know the list goes on, but the International Organization for Migration, or a physician, at which point designated by the U.S. Embassy, conduct applicant medical screenings. And this specific screening ensures that the applicant does not have any, communicable diseases that could pose a public health threat. And, if so, then this may prohibit their admission to the United States. So, the screening process takes 18 to 24 months after referral from UNHCR. And upon, this is all pre-arrival, right? So upon arrival, travel arrangements are facilitated through the coordination of U.S. resettlement agencies and the International Organization of Migration. And so after a refugee has been conditionally accepted by DHS, USCIS, the RSC sends a request for sponsorship assurance to the U.S. And this process specifically is managed by the Refugee Processing Center, which is something, or an agency part of the State Department. And it happens in coordination with the 9 national refugee resettlement agencies, CWS being one of them. And this is really where a refugee is ultimately resettled within the U.S. and is determined by, one of the 9 U.S. resettlement agencies and their vast networks of community partners. And so, upon arrival, refugees are welcomed and provided assistance as they become established in their new communities. But, to go back to assess the overall process, this takes several years, many years, and the various security and medical checks are all valid for different periods of time. So it is important to consider that, because We often talk about these checks as a Venn diagram when a person has about a 2-month time period when all their checks are still valid. And if any one of those checks expires, it kicks off a domino effect where other checks begin to expire, right? So this is particularly challenging for families where it can be extremely difficult to align their travel ready windows. So, many family members travel separately for this or because of this, and unfortunately can be separated for many years.
Wow. Thank you for that. That helps, my understanding on the process. And I think that that kind of leads right into our discussion today when we talk about presidential determination, because you're just talking about that window that is open. So can you give us a little bit of background on presidential determination on the refugee admissions process?
Yeah, so the Bipartisan Refugee Act of 1980 created the modern U.S. resettlement program, right? The Refugee Act of 1980 is a public, or perhaps insured, a public private partnership that helps refugees integrate and thrive in the United States. That legislation is the cornerstone of the U.S. refugee admissions program and gives the president the authority to set the annual refugee admissions goal, which is called the Presidential Determination, or just PD. And this happens after consultation with Congress every single year, right? So the PD, or refugee admissions goal, is an important step in setting a target number of refugees that the United States plans to welcome through the U.S. resettlement program in a given fiscal year. And so the administration uses that PD as a planning figure when talking to Congress about federal funding for the refugee accounts and in consultation with refugee resettlement agencies and planning for arrivals appropriately that fiscal year. And so, the legislation does not require that the president meets the goal, which is why it is so important that community members and organizations such as CWS around the country hold the administration accountable to seeing that the United States meets the refugee admissions goal. And uh, for this year specifically, the PD is 125,000, for example, right? And so before the previous administration, the averaged admissions goal was 95,000, and the averaged actual arrivals number was 80,000. So there isn't much of a gap there. However, we have welcomed 207,000 in a single year in the 80s, right? And more than 3 million refugees have been resettled in the United States since 1980. So we have to ensure that there is capacity to welcome those who are fleeing persecution.
Uh, that kind of leads right into our next discussion, which is the numbers from the previous administration. President Obama, we know he had the numbers between 75 and I believe 85. He actually raised it in the middle of a year. Is that correct?
He did, yeah, he did, and this is due to the Syrian refugee crisis.
Now, is that seen often where a president will make that change during a fiscal year?
Perhaps not often, but it really does depend on a given crisis.
Okay.
It really does depend on what's happening.
Sure. No, and because the following year he had the number, I believe it was 110, if I'm looking at my notes correct. But then that was the last year of his administration, and
Mhm.
then during President Trump's administration, that number actually dropped down to, I believe it would hit a low of 15 during his last year. Um, what kind of ripple effects? Not only, I mean, I can only just imagine. You're just saying, you would see a number of 95 and 80,000 would be brought in. So not only is the admissions affected, but I can imagine that it affects other agencies and other organizations as well.
Absolutely. It impacts, the whole program. It impacts individuals. It impacts a lot of people. It impacts the country. Um, to answer your question, right, what are the ripple effects? And you mentioned the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and specifically during the Trump administration, he set a consecutive record low refugee admissions goal during his time in office, just as you mentioned. And he completely disseminated the overseas and domestic resettlement infrastructure. He resettled very few refugees at a time when the number of refugees was hitting unprecedented highs, right? Which was not only unfortunate to see, but it was extremely distressing to many. And so the refugee resettlement program, you have to understand, or people have to understand, is that it's not a faucet that can be turned on and off, right? The Trump administration repeatedly tried to grind the program to a halt, not only by setting the record low admission goals, but also by not accepting referrals to the U.S. resettlement program from UNHCR altogether. And he did so by restricting the number of refugees who were interviewed or vetted by DHS or and through other security vetting agencies. He did so, or the administration did so, by ending resettlement based on vulnerability and instead focused on particular populations of concern, and by closing resettlement offices and forcing resettlement partners to lay off staff, and ultimately by doing their best to eliminate our nation's capacity to welcome, right? And so at the same time, community members from around the countries, and this includes congregations, former volunteers who used to work with refugee resettlement offices, um, former refugees themselves waiting to reunify with their loved ones, all were asking the Trump administration, where are the refugees? Where are they? And so asking that question and pressuring this administration to continue resettling refugees was critically important in making sure we had a program to rebuild by the end of that administration. And so today, UNHCR estimates that almost 1.5 million people are in urgent need of resettlement. And that number will continue to rise, right? And so specifically, there were more than 31 million refugees, the highest number in recorded history. And in 2021, more than two-thirds of all refugees and displaced peoples abroad came from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Burma. And all of these countries not only continue to face individuals in these countries continue to face persecution, but we will continue to see refugees coming from these countries. And so we must ensure safe pathways and, increase our capacity to welcome.
Now, you just mentioned, those 5 countries. I imagine Ukraine is now being added to
Yeah.
that list here in 2022 with what we were seeing. Will there be additional countries that you anticipate seeing added to that as well as we, last couple months here of 2022 and going into 2023?
Uh, I mean, we hope not, but there may be additional countries. Unfortunately, I know this is off topic, not about the presidential determination, but
Mhm.
with Title 42 expansions, in response to heavy migration from countries like Venezuela and Haiti and others, we may see a response and we may see an increased number of people. However, um, coming into the winter months, right, we will see a slowdown a little bit, specifically people crossing through the border. But we hope that numbers won't increase in FY23, but
Mhm.
hopefully we are ready for an increase of refugees coming into the country.
Okay. Um, so let's jump back onto presidential determination, and we'll put the past in the past, and let's look at what we have going on now with President Biden and his administration. This past September, they set a number of 125,000. Now, if I remember correctly, that was the same number that was set for fiscal year 2022, or is that my doing my number years right?
Yes.
23 is the
Yeah.
number. Okay, okay.
Mhm.
Um, so the number was set for 125 last year, but only just over 26,000 came in. Refugees were admitted here in the United States. Um, if we're looking at the math, that's about 20% admitted. What kind of factors would play into the fact that it was only a 20% admission rate to that number?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And there are a few factors, right? And so one of them is that the Biden administration did not begin rebuilding the US resettlement program immediately after inauguration. And that was unfortunately as many of us expected, right? And so in fact, actually, the Biden administration, initially kept the Trump administration's record low admissions goal of 15,000 refugees in place until public pressure from community members convinced the administration to increase the cap in FY21. And, and I think that the increase, was to around 62,000.
Mhm.
But as I said before, the resettlement program isn't a faucet. You can't just, turn it on and off. It's more likely um, that you can perceive it perhaps as a long hose that takes a long time to rebuild, right? And so after the fall of Kabul, the US resettled more than 76,000 Afghans who were welcomed through humanitarian parole. Not through the US resettlement program, but served by our resettlement sites nonetheless. And we did that with a dismantled program that the administration began rebuilding in earnest while we were resettling evacuated Afghans, right? CWS resettled more people between the Afghan relocation and resettlement program in the US, the US refugee admissions program than we had in the previous 4 years combined. And so we had to adjust. There were a lot of adjustments made. And this year, we expect the Afghans who are relocated to the US to be processed through the US refugee admissions program. And so, there really is no excuse at this point to not see a significant increase in the number of refugee arrivals this year. That being said, we have demonstrated the resilience of the resettlement program, and we call on people who support refugees and former refugees themselves to make their voices heard and tell the administration to resettle as many refugees this year as possible and reach the 125,000 goal.
Well, you just actually, that's a great lead into my next question. If there, you talk about, admit as many as possible. How many, do we think would be ready to be, if there was, I understand the ceiling's at 125, but let's say that ceiling wasn't there. Is there more than 125,000 that would be ready to be admitted here in fiscal year 2023?
That's a good question, Adam. Without a signed presidential determination, the resettlement program does not resettle refugees, right? So we have to have a PD. You need the president to sign a refugee admissions goal to resume refugee arrivals. So we can't really say there can't, if there wasn't a ceiling, there has to be a ceiling, right? And so as of early September 2022, there were under 73,000 refugees in the United States, or through the US refugee admissions program pipeline, right? And so that includes refugees who had been pre-screened by an RSC approved by USCIS and those who are ready for departure. And unfortunately, only a fraction of the number of refugees in the pipeline at any given time will be able to be resettled in a single fiscal year. And so, in fact, we potentially resettle only 1% of those who need to be resettled. And so, I think, you need a PD to resume refugee arrivals. But, that has how it has historically played out.
Well, now, Noah, you've given me a great deal to to understand and to better understand how this works. What could I or our viewers do to help, with refugees who are coming into our communities, or refugees agencies? How can we help those who are settling in our communities, or know that they're coming into our communities?
Absolutely, yeah. Um, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is to use our action alerts on our website to uplift your own voices and the voices of your communities, the voices of refugees and immigrants. Excuse me. You can do so by checking out our website. I think excuse me, the links will be provided. The website is CWS. Global.org/action alerts to see our latest calls to action that connect you to your 2 senators and 1 representative. So, for example, we not only have an action alert for the presidential determination, but we also have an action alert to urge Congress to support and pass the Afghan Adjustment Act so that relocated Afghans have an opportunity to become lawful permanent residents, right? So, that is one way you can engage. And another way is to invite communities around the country to tell their members of Congress, their state legislators, and their local officials to welcome refugees, to provide robust funding so that communities are equipped with the resources they need to help our new neighbors integrate and thrive. Um, and finally, hold the administration accountable to, increasing refugee arrivals this specific fiscal year. Another thing that you can do is perhaps amplify this message in, your local newspaper, through opinion editorials, or letters to the editor, even. And if you have an active, Twitter account or Instagram, you can use social media. And finally, people can host events, right? So this can happen either in person or virtually. Um, you can host events in your communities, such as around World Refugee Day on June 20th each year, and on other important days and holidays that are special to you. Um, and finally, perhaps you can reach out to advocacy@cws.org for advocacy toolkits with template resources and instructions, such as on how to organize and schedule meetings with your members of Congress, how to plan for such meetings, um, and how to really prepare your team to attend such meetings. And they also include talking points, which are incredibly helpful. And people can finally sign up to receive our action alerts and resources at the link that I think will be provided in the chat. Or on the screen. But yeah, so I think those are ways you can get involved, amplify your own voice, empower yourselves and your community. Um, the CWS website specifically has a lot of resources. In addition to the action alerts, we have, many other resources that you can view and keep track of any perhaps uh, press releases, for example, just so you can stay up to date on, not only what is happening in this space, but, the what our actions are going to be like and what our stand is in regards to specific, decisions that are made by the administration and Congress.
Mhm. Well, Nuha, I appreciate the time today. I've learned quite a bit and taken quite a bit from this conversation. So thank you so much for your time today. I feel like we're cutting us short because I feel like we could talk for at least another 30 minutes.
Absolutely.
But as you said, it's a beautiful day out there. So I'll let you go. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you want to learn more, we've got the links in the chat that you saw us post. You can learn more about presidential determination and your work that you can do advocating for refugees and their rights here. So hope if you haven't liked this video, share this video out with your friends and family members or groups that you are a part of. We hope you'll join us next month. We're going to be live here on December 7th, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be joined by Tiffany Nelms. She is an Associate Director for Home Study and Post-Release Services, and we're going to be talking about the work that Church World Service is doing with unaccompanied minors. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. Don't go away. We do have a short video we're going to play here for you to talk a little bit more about refugees. Thank you again, and hope you stay safe.
Who are refugees? Refugees are people just like you and me. People with lives, plans, and dreams for the future. But war, violence, and persecution have forced them to make an incredibly difficult choice. Some faced danger because of who they are and what they believe. Some are in danger because they spoke out on behalf of their neighbors who were marginalized. Others have watched as their homes were destroyed and their neighborhoods became war zones. All of them left everything behind for a chance at safety for themselves and their families. Once refugees arrive in a new country, they register with the United Nations Refugee Agency to access protection and other benefits. Some live in refugee camps. Many live in cities and towns, beginning new lives in their host countries. There are more than 80 million people who have been forcibly displaced from their homes. 26 million are refugees as defined by the UN. Less than 1% of refugees get the opportunity to be resettled in a third country like the United States. How do refugees get resettled in the United States? Although they have made it out of immediate danger, some particularly vulnerable refugees cannot remain in the country they fled to. These refugees may have urgent medical needs, be survivors of torture, or they may be in danger of further persecution. The UN Refugee Agency identifies the refugees who are most in need of resettlement to a safe third country, like the United States, and refers their cases to the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. These refugees undergo thorough background, biometric, security, and health screenings before being approved to travel to the United States. A regional resettlement support center provides information and classes to prepare them for life in the United States, and then their travel is booked. Each week, refugee resettlement agencies like CWS are assigned the cases of arriving refugee families. As soon as these families arrive in the United States, we are there to welcome them to their new home and provide the services they need to rebuild their lives.